So I started giving my responses to this episode of Battle of Ideas, which is the one that stars Peter Lloyd, and it's called What's Wrong with Men's Rights. I always thought it would be quite nice to have an MRA presence on the Battle of Ideas panels. I think it's rather a shame that the only time that we actually do get to appear is when we're trying to justify whether or not men's rights should be a thing or not. However, this is the first of a few, and I don't seem to get very far on this one, admittedly. The others are going to get a bit further, but this first episode is going to be chiefly about domestic violence against men, because it's one of the things brought up by Lydia Smith, who starts off with a very toxic anti-MRA monologue. After we've dispensed with her initial monologue, then we'll start getting through this thing a lot faster. So this one is mainly going to be about Refuge, which I have already touched upon in the Fear of Bed
Welcome
videos.
to this Battle of Ideas debate. What is wrong with men's rights?
That man there is Luke Gittos. He has written a book that's rather good, actually, called The Dangerous Myth of Rape Culture, which I recommend.
I'm Luke. I'm the chair for this discussion. I'm not going to speak for very long. All I'll say is that I'm generally someone who's quite sceptical of the whole idea of men's rights. And having had a chat with our panel this morning, we've got two speakers who are broadly critical of the men's rights movement and one who is broadly a proponent. But there is always, even for someone who's critical of the idea, there is some niggling problems that do present themselves. There is statistics which suggest that young men are falling behind in school and later in their professional life. There are issues with regards to equality of the law and men in the position of challenging certain legal decisions do face arguably disproportionate problems. So, I mean, even as someone who's broadly sceptical, I have some genuine concerns, and obviously our speakers will be able to unpack these issues a lot more.
The concern he raises in his book is what he calls a war on intimacy, which is basically the rape crisis hysteria. But he hasn't made it a men's issue, he's made it a societal issue in general, which I suppose it is. It is, broadly, and it's going to spill out eventually. It's hurting men first, men are on the front line of the war on intimacy, but it is going to spill out to women too, and maybe it's already doing so.
So the first to speak will be Lydia Smith. Lydia is a journalist for the International Business Times. She's a writer on human rights, health and gender. Thank you very much for being with us, Lydia.
She's also pretty poisonous, as you'll find out as soon as she starts doing a little speech.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. So, most of you will have heard of men's rights activists. You may have seen their websites, blogs, you may have seen them on Twitter.
I've got a sneaking suspicion that she has never actually seen the men's rights website or read a men's rights blog. Just a suspicion.
Those who haven't been banned from Twitter, that is. You may have even seen some of them on TV or bought their books. So let me start by saying that men in Britain have problems. Boys underperform in education. 60,000 fewer men go to university each year than women. Our prison populations are overwhelmingly male. And suicide is, of course, the biggest killer of men, middle-aged men, in the UK. These are problems we need to address. But the problem is that men's rights don't address these issues.
It's funny, isn't it? About 4 years ago, feminists were saying that men had no issues. Now they admit they have them, but men's rights activists are doing nothing about them. No, 4 years ago you denied they existed. Now you have to admit they existed. And you think that we've done nothing. We've dragged your heels that far, so you actually now have to admit that these things are issues. And the only recourse you have now is a claim that we do nothing about them.
Its activism has the reach and the influence to help engineer actual change, but instead it exploits these issues for one aim, to fuel anti-women rhetoric.
I get it. So we're not addressing these issues, we're exploiting them to fuel anti-woman rhetoric. Whereas the feminists are exploiting them to fuel anti-masculinity rhetoric.
Instead of looking at the causes of poor education and unemployment, which include race, class, and the rigid constructs of masculinity, men's rights twist the talking points of women's rights to improve that men are in fact the more oppressed gender.
Oppression is not a word that MRAs often use, but feminists do. And feminists think that the rigid constructs upon women are part of oppression. So if women's rigid constructs come from oppression, where do men's rigid constructs come from? Now, I think the group of men that are doing most to challenge rigid constructs of masculinity are not the men and masculinity studies pro-feminist men's movement led by Kimmel. I think the grouping of men that's doing most to challenge rigid constructs of masculinity is MGTOW, or more broadly speaking, the Zeta male philosophy, because those rigid constructs come about as a result of seeking the approval of women in order to validate one's self-worth. Oppression has more than one meaning. Oppression can be anything caused from distress or anxiety, can be called oppression, if you like, by one of the definitions in the dictionary. Oppression doesn't necessarily imply there is an oppressor, but if it comes to claiming there is an oppressor and oppressed dynamic in society, it's feminists. Men's rights activists are not claiming that there is an oppressor and oppressed dynamic going on. But there's a lot of anti-male fear-mongering, and we know where that's coming from. Furthermore, the reason that our discussion on men's issues has been so retarded, may I clarify what I mean by the word retarded, slow in developing, awful when words change their meaning, and we can't use them legitimately anymore, is because of the feminist oppressed narrative that we've been given regarding the roles of the genders. So it is actually pretty crucial to our work that we challenge the idea that women are oppressed by men. And when we challenge that idea, feminists get the impression that we must be insisting that we are oppressed by women. I don't think they quite understand that it is possible for a system to exist in which one group is not oppressing another. I really feel I should also address the fact you've got a class there, that we ignore class. That is actually feasibly a legitimate criticism, except she's a feminist and she's done quite a bit to derail the discussion of class inequality as well. That argument can be levelled at all gender politics. The fact that the feminists are so obsessed with the glass ceiling, which doesn't affect most women or men, because most women and men don't get up to the sort of level where the glass ceiling actually has any effect. And the reason the wives of men that are above the glass ceiling are not looking to get major careers above the glass ceiling themselves is because they got a husband who's already above the glass ceiling and is earning quite sufficient that she can live quite comfortably without having a high-powered career. Anyway, that is clearly a topic for another video because it's vast. So there's something interesting here that needs addressing. See, my initial response there is saying, oh, well, yeah, I think this is a vast issue because feminism has kind of derailed the left and derailed socialism by placing gender equality issues ahead, in terms of priority, ahead of class inequality issues, and sometimes in direct contradiction with class inequality issues. However, there is something interesting here, because you'll notice the things he's talking about there, the men's issues, for example, the overrepresentation of men in prisons, the underrepresentation of men in education, the overrepresentation of men in unemployment figures and in suicides. Obviously, these are all class-related issues. So, Why is it men? Why is class not having as much effect on women as it has on men? And this has been demonstrated as well of life expectancies. There are inequalities between the classes on life expectancies, and as the inequalities of class have grown since the 1980s, when there was a change in the sort of economic philosophy, or the philosophy of economics, that was very much in favour of larger inequalities in class. The differences in life expectancies between the classes were much more profound for men than they were for women. In some way, it is true that men suffer more from class inequality than women do.
For example, both men and women suffer domestic violence. But has the men's rights movement set up shelters for men?
Yeah, sadly, I never knew Earl Silverman, but I imagine that's probably an incredibly offensive comment to anyone that did.
Have they called for government inquiries? Do they raise money for research to show the scope of violence against men?
The research bloody exists. The research is there. We got research by Harvard. We got research by Murray Strauss. Research has been ignored. The research has been ignored because it doesn't fit the feminist narrative.
No, instead they spend their time trolling women to dispute the data about the scale of domestic violence that they face. That's
trolling women by giving links to those studies that already exist that prove what the scope is. For example, that 70% of non-reciprocal violence is initiated by women, which is what the Harvard study found, and near parity of domestic violence, which is what the Murray Strauss study found. Or even just the 1 in 3 victims of domestic violence are men, which appears in official statistics produced by the government in both Australia and the UK. Even the 1 in 3 is considered to be derailing by the feminists. That's trolling. So there's no point in us doing the studies, no point in us funding the studies, because it'd be trolling whenever we present those figures. I'm not going to waste my money on a study to replicate what already exists, which is already counted as trolling if you point it out to anyone.
That's not activism. In choosing to spew misogyny and hate rather than effect actual change, these keyboard crusaders are betraying the very people they claim to help, men.
Whereas she is brimming of compassion, as you can see. I don't know what it is about that mouth. There's something about that mouth that just seems... It takes a lot of lemons to create a mouth like that. I think what's happened is she obviously decided a long time ago that smiling was unpaid emotional labour, and she wasn't going to do it anymore. Unless she was getting a good wage for it. I'm not smiling again. It's not my job to smile.
As a result, it falls to charities like Refuge, a domestic violence charity set up by Women for Women that actually set up services for men across the country.
She's quite right, of course, when she says that Refuge was set up by women. In fact, the woman specifically that set up Refuge back when it was called the Chiswick Women's Aid in 1971 was Erin Pizzey. We know why Erin Pizzey, well, most of us already know why Erin Pizzey left Refuge. If you don't, then I will quickly just bring you up to speed. Erin Pizzey left because her research led her to believe that domestic violence tended to be reciprocal. I can read here. Soon after establishing her first refuge, Pizzey asserted that much domestic violence was reciprocal, with both partners abusing each other in roughly equal measure. She reached this conclusion when she asked the women in a refuge about their violence, only to discover most of the women were equally as violent or more violent than their husbands. In her study, comparative study of battered women and violence-prone women, co-researched with Dr. John Gayford of Warlingham Hospital, Pizzey distinguished between genuine battered women and violence-prone women. The former defined as the unwilling and innocent victim of his or her partner's violence, and the latter defined as the unwilling victim of his or her own violence. study reported that 62% of the sample population were more accurately described as violence-prone. Similar findings regarding the mutuality of domestic violence have been confirmed in subsequent studies. This led to her being seen as psychologically impure by the radical feminists who removed her from Refuge. Pizzy is now a patron of the charity Mankind Initiative, which might have been a better charity to name than Refuge. However, let's have a look at Refuge's site, shall we? It is looking like it's very much for women, isn't it? With its very, very pink website. However, the association between pink and female is just cultural. It's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because some feminists are very against the association of pink with femininity because it's used to police choices in gender, and yet it's also a wing of feminism that are very, very into using pink as a sort of badge for women in general. And a lot of those feminists, the ones that really love the pink, seem to be Labour MPs. Harriet Harman's pink van. In fact, the reason that those feminists like it is the exact reason the other feminists don't, because it's very useful for policing gender. Yes, they seem to be making this website pink, so men know it's not for them. Anyway, get help now. Let's see if they are doing anything for men. Well, there is actually a link for help for men. Let's have a look at that. Help for men that are abused. We recognise that men can also be victims of domestic violence, both in heterosexual and gay relationships. Refuge believes that everyone has the right to live in safety, free from fear, regardless of their gender. Refuge runs a number of services for male victims of domestic violence across the country. These are primarily independent domestic violence advocacy and outreach services to provide practical and emotional support for men who are experiencing domestic violence. If you're a man who is being abused, you can read our page of information and support. We also find it helpful to read the areas of the website which talk generally about domestic violence. That's interesting, isn't it? And then it's got this section here for abusers. If you are abusive towards your partner and would like to change your behaviour, you can find out more on these pages. So if you link on that, it gets you to contact Respect. Respect to run the DVPP programs. So one question you might want to know is there such a service for women? Is there a service for female abusers? No. No, there isn't. There's no service for female abusers. Maybe they just haven't got round to it yet. Maybe that's a women's issue that hasn't yet been dealt with. Maybe there is a call for feminism. Only men have somewhere to go if they have a problem with abusing their partner. No such services exist for women yet. Almost as if they don't recognise that women can abuse their partner. Now, I want to go to this guide to recognising abuse. I just want to check when it goes help for men, and it says talking me about domestic violence. Where does that take you? Well, it says statistics show the vast majority of domestic violence incidents are carried out by men and experienced by women. It says so here. Sorry, the vast majority. I mean, if we were to say 2/3, maybe, which is what some statistics show, although we have seen other statistics that suggest near parity, and even statistics that suggest that when it comes to non-reciprocal violence, 70% of non-reciprocal violence is initiated by women. But when you're talking about a vast majority, you're not just talking about 2/3, are you? It doesn't exactly fill you with confidence if the charity you're going to for help as a victim of domestic violence believes that the vast majority of domestic violence instances are carried out by men and experienced by women. So here's some other interesting things. What causes domestic violence? It is not caused by alcohol. Good, actually. I kind of agree, and I don't like the fact that alcohol is often demonized when talking about domestic violence. That's a step forward from feminism's temperance movement origins, isn't it? Because that was always a way of demonizing alcohol, or suggest that it was responsible for domestic violence. Unemployment, stress, or ill health? Well, actually, I think probably violence has got something to do with stress. And we do know unemployment contributes to domestic violence. And when it says ill health, well, yeah, that does too. Ill health, particularly if it's mental health, can contribute to domestic violence. Another obvious example might be diabetes. I had a teacher when I was at school who was actually generally a good teacher. One day he had a funny turn, decided he was going to give the slipper to several kids in school. By giving the slipper, this meant beating their backsides with a trainer. Or for any Americans listening, a sneaker or gym shoe. Allegedly because they'd drawn on their books, drawn on the covers of their books. Seems a bit of a harsh punishment for very minor graffiti on something that is your own property anyway, and it's going to be disposed of eventually. Anyway, transpired he hadn't taken his insulin, so his odd behaviour was brought on by the effect of diabetes. So if diabetes can cause you to act out of character in a way that is violent, diabetes is a health issue. Actually, this is interesting. So there's a few more about the myths. Many men are violent when they're stoned. Men now. Men. Oh, many men who drink never lay a finger on the partner. True. I do think that alcohol just brings out your true nature. It doesn't make you do things that are contrary to your character. What alcohol does, alcohol makes men less stoical, so it has them acting upon their emotions more than they would ordinarily. Blaming drink or drugs is an excuse. I think actually it's a way of demonizing drink and drugs, actually. A way of denying responsibility. Both may be the trigger for a particular attack, but they're not the underlying cause. I don't think they're the trigger. I think they are a permitter. Hold on. It's all very well for me to say, well, I don't think that alcohol causes you to do anything that's out of character. But we're talking about feminists here who are running this site. These are the same people who ideologically believe that it's possible to be too drunk to consent, because what you'll be doing will be out of character. So if a man commits violence when he's drunk, he can't blame the drink. And I agree with that, actually. I think if you're violent when you're drunk, you're probably violent anyway. You're probably just managing to keep a lid on your violence ordinarily. But if you sleep around when you're drunk, you're responsible for that as well. You can't go claiming that's you be getting raped just because you're drunk. You know, I wouldn't have done that if I was sober. Yeah, but you're still responsible for it. The same with the violence. Just you say, I wouldn't have done that if I was sober. Yeah, but you've done it. There's no one else that you can make responsible for your behaviour when you're drunk, other than yourself. Whatever it is that you do when you're drunk, you have to accept that is part of your character. You are a violent person who manages to keep a lid on it when you're sober. It's the same as, you're a promiscuous person who manages to keep a lid on it when you're sober. We can't have one rule for one gender and one rule for the other. Either both genders are responsible for what they do when they're drunk, or neither are. If it only happens in poor families on council estates. No, I don't think anyone actually believes that it only happens in poor families on council estates. I think what is being said is that it is more common in poor families, and it is more common in poor families. There is a strong link between poverty and domestic violence. I don't know why that's in denial. All women would leave if the abuse was that bad. Well, that actually goes both ways. Yeah, I knew a guy who'd been accused of rape by his girlfriend, and then he said, she's done it before. She's made this claim before. 4 times before. I said, okay, so firstly, if you have actually raped her, then why is she still with you? And come to that, if she's accused you of rape 4 times, why are you still with her? One of them is staying with a partner that's abusive. We don't know which one's which, do we? We don't know whether it's him staying with somebody that's repeatedly made false allegations against him, or her staying with somebody who has repeatedly raped her. We don't know. We don't know one way or the other. But either way, somebody there is staying with somebody that's abusive towards them. I should point out they weren't even living together. It's not a question of they shared the rent and it was really awkward to split up. They were living in separate accommodations. So when I say they're still together, or they were still together, what I mean is they were continuing to keep seeing each other, and clearly they had bad news for each other. So the question is, why does he stay? I asked him that, and he said, because I love her. Yeah, so that goes both ways. Why do people stay with people that are horrible to them in some way or other? And quite often because they're in love with them. Abusers grow up in violent homes. This is not true. Growing up in a violent home is a risk factor, and some children who experience abuse go on to be abusive in their relationships, but many do not. So they repel by violence because they see the damage it causes being either way. Oh, here we go. Abusers learn to be violent from the society they grow up in. I don't know why is that making a difference? Surely their home is the society they grew up in, suggesting that our culture is the same throughout the entirety of society, which it isn't. Inequality between the sexes means that men have more power than women. Inevitably, some of them abuse or exploit that power. Ah, shit. So here we see what this is all amounting to. All the refutation of every theory there is about the causes of violence. So you go, no, it's not about stress. It's not about stress. It's not alcohol, which I kind of agree with. But anyway. It's not about unemployment, it's not about poverty, it's not about the fact that you've experienced violence, it's not about mental illness. You know what it's about patriarchy. Unless you get something about patriarchy, you don't really understand domestic violence. That's basically what this list of myths is. It's a rather interesting rhetorical device the feminists use repeatedly, is to claim that something is a myth. And think that by claiming it's a myth, it makes it suddenly not true. You don't need to back up the fact that it's not true with any evidence. You just need to say, oh yeah, it's a myth. Oh, it's a commonly misheld conception. It's a commonly held misconception, and that's it. Argument over. They've managed to completely refute any evidence to the contrary done by psychologists over long periods of time. They can refute all that with just the one phrase. That's a myth. If I call it a myth, it suddenly becomes not true. People who blame violence on their childhood experiences are avoiding taking responsibility for their actions. No, because giving a reason isn't giving an excuse. Understanding the reasons behind something does not necessarily excuse them. I really feel that I need to bring in a bit of Vera's Fallen Women here, because I think we need to remember how these rules, and I think there's a reason why this page of myths is all talking about male perpetrators. I want to remind you of something that Vera said.
Importantly, we found out that about 70% of women in custody had 2 or more mental health issues and either drug or alcohol abuse. Many had had early lives in care, but here was the very fascinating and sad fact, which was that about 50% had suffered from violence at home and about a third had been sexually assaulted. If you look at the usual figures that 1 in 4 women in society suffer from violence at home, you can see that they had exactly twice the frequency of it.
Is this list sounding very familiar? Isn't this list of the things associated with criminality in women sounding awfully similar to the list of things that we were told were a myth if they were used to explain men's violence? The page doesn't make it clear it's talking specifically about men's violence all these explanations that have been given from the I'm using the word explanations. I'm using it advisedly. I'm not saying excuses. I'm not saying it should be excuses when describing male behaviour, and I'm saying it shouldn't be excuses when it's describing female behaviour. Whatever actions you perform, whatever the causes of them, it's still you that's got to take responsibility for them, because no one else is going to. Like I said, you're not in control of everything you do, in the same way as the manager of a business is in control of everything that that business does. But the buck still has to stop him. Right? It's the same list.
And they had twice the frequency too of sexual abuse. And so we sat back and we thought about the two pieces of work we'd done, and we concluded that when we considered victims of crime who largely had suffered from domestic or sexual abuse, and when we considered defendants in crime who largely had been thrown into chaos by their experiences of sexual and domestic abuse, that actually we were talking about the same people.
Yeah, remember that? Vera Bear is a trustee of Refuge. This isn't me just like pulling up two random feminists and going, hey, that feminist over there is saying this, and that feminist over there is saying something completely different. That's completely contradictory. You know, they are two different people. I do see memes like that sometimes. I do think you do realise they are two completely different people, even though they are going under the same banner. I don't want to be held responsible for things that some other people that call themselves MRAs say. I don't think it's particularly fair to hold one feminist is also saying another feminist says, just because there's a contradiction between the two things. However, this is definite hypocrisy. This Refuge is the charity that Vera Baird is a trustee of, and it makes it quite clear that men are always in control, and none of these factors have any effect on whether or not they're likely to be violent. But she'll talk about the causes of female criminality, and then say, and when I considered the victims of domestic and sexual abuse, and I considered the perpetrators that be thrown into chaos by experiences of domestic violence abuse, I realised it's the same people. So yeah, okay, so your past experiences have an effect on your behaviour if you're a woman, but a man is just completely in control. And I'd like to reiterate, it's the same bloody list. The same things. Oh, it's a myth, this is a myth, this is a myth, this is a myth. On what causes domestic violence. And yet, for female criminality, exactly the same list. It's something to think about. Slight clarification and correction there. Vera Baird isn't a trustee of Refuge. She's a trustee of Respect and Victims Person Northumbria, but they make exactly the same claims. Just to clarify that. She's not actually a trustee of Refuge. She's a trustee of a very similar charity, and she is a trustee of Respect, which we're also talking about because they make the same claims. Violence is a choice an abuser makes. I was saying in Joe Todd's Training School for Men how choice is very much emphasized when it comes to male perpetrators of violence or abuse, whereas women's helplessness is very much emphasized. Some women like violence. Women do not enjoy violence or find it a turn on. Well, actually, some do. Some do. You can't be in denial about that. Some do. You can't deny it when 50 Shades of Grey is a bestseller. This is also a refutation of Erin Pizzey's Prone to Violence, of course, which does talk exactly about that, how women can get addicted to the high associated with emotional rush of a fight. Not just women, of course. People of both sexes can get addicted to being in a relationship with an abusive person because the violence itself is exciting. It gives you all the endorphin rushes and everything. And they like the making up afterwards. So there can be a masochistic attraction to abusive relationships. And that's true both men and women. Not just women. But it doesn't matter. The point is the feminists were in denial about it. The feminists were in denial that any of the women that were going to these refuges and were actually addicted to abusive partners, whereas Erin was finding that quite a few of them were. Abusive men have a mental illness. The vast majority of men who abuse women are not mentally ill. Okay, so they're perfectly healthy. So it's perfectly normal to abuse women, is what you're saying. It's perfectly normal to abuse women. It's perfectly healthy. And therefore, it is almost like denial of mental illness.
Importantly, we found out that about 70% of women in custody had 2 or more mental health issues.
Which has nothing to do with violence. She's talking about female criminals. Oh, they have mental health issues. But it has nothing to do with male violence. When men are violent, there's nothing to do with mental health issues. When women are violent, it has. If you watch Vera Bed's Fallen Women, you'll know that what I said about mental illness there was that you can pretty much always find one. And that criminality is almost by definition a sign of mental illness, because reckless behaviour is a symptom. So you could probably find a mental illness. What do we actually mean when we say a mental illness? Right, mental illness isn't an excuse, and it would be bad therapy for mental illness to be used as an excuse for any behaviour. One of the things I'm rather concerned about, actually, with this shifting of the goalposts of what is consent and what isn't consent, is at some point the goalpost is going to be shifted to include 2 mentally ill to consent, at which point it would just be impossible for anyone to have sex. Because somebody else would decide, well, that's a socially inappropriate behaviour, they must be mentally ill. Mental illness really is a social construct. And that doesn't mean it's a bad social construct, because a lot of social constructs aren't bad. When we say mental illness, what we mean is this person has a difficulty of living, let's say, a dis-ease, the literal meaning of disease, that is mental. There's a mental problem that makes life difficult for them, and we need to find a way of solving it. So actually, it's rather strange for them to say, oh, there's no such thing as mental illness. This isn't mental illness now. Actually, it is. By definition. By saying it's not mental illness, you're actually saying, oh, that behaviour is alright. You are literally saying that is normal. We don't do anything we need to do about that. That doesn't need any therapy, it's fine. Let them do it. But whether we decide something is an illness or not really is down to us as a society. So what we're kind of doing is saying, oh, don't let psychologists do it. Psychologists don't know what's best. You know what's best? We do. We're the experts here. Psychologists know nothing. It's real anti-psychology shtick to say it's not mental illness. Furthermore, isn't the DVPP programs, aren't they therapy of a sort? It's just feminist approved therapy, right? So their mental illness, as I say, it is a social construct, is patriarchy itself. But they want to deprogram patriarchal opinions from the man. That's their therapy. Because as far as they're concerned, he's not a victim of any kind of mental illness, apart from the mental illness that's in our society as a whole, which is patriarchy. They're not worried about that being used as an excuse. He can't say, I can't help it, I was indoctrinated by patriarchy. She can. She can say, oh, I can't help it, I've got internalized misogyny. She can say that, but he can't. Because he's a hyper agent. Everything's in his control. It was all his choice. But at the same time, he has to recognize that it was all his choice, and then he has to recognize that it's because he felt entitled, because society had made him feel entitled to do these things. And yet, when Vera was talking about female criminality, she'd say, oh, they all had 2 or 3 mental illnesses. Mental illness does not excuse your behaviour. If you have BPD, and I know BPD leads to some very antisocial behaviours and unpleasant behaviours and abusive behaviours. Having BPD does not excuse those behaviours. Trying to avoid having those behaviours is a challenge for you in life. That's one of your life challenges, is not to be abusive if you have BPD. And if an abusive man were mentally ill, why is it that he only abuses his partner, not his colleagues, strangers or friends? How do you know that's the case? How do you know that the only person he abuses is his partner? It sounds like he's talking about a specific man, isn't it? Why is it that he only abuses his partner? He doesn't abuse anyone else, he only abuses his partner. And also it's a very different situation. A domestic situation is very different from a situation with people that work colleagues. Emotionally it's different. In many ways, I've always said your partner is the person that you get naked with, metaphorically speaking as well as literally. They're the person with whom you have no inhibitions, the person whom you don't edit yourself. So if violence is going to erupt, it's far more likely to erupt with somebody that you are intimate with than it is with somebody that you know only as a work colleague. So they're in denial about stress, they're in denial about the effects of mental health. They're very keen here to make the man a hyper agent, so he's not losing his temper. So it's insisted that he's in control. And all this says men throughout, men. Alright. Okay, so that isn't what I wanted to show you. That's just something I got sidelined into. Hold on, let's remember how I got there. Help for men. You may also find it helpful. This is for men who are abused. You also may find it helpful to read the areas of the website which talk generally about domestic violence. And that told us that the majority of incidents are carried out by men. And it gave us a link to the myths about domestic violence, which says that he's always in control. It says very clearly that it's men. Very in denial about the humanity of the experience. Alright, let's go for help for women again, because I wanted to read this. Guide to Recognizing Abuse. Now remember, this one here, this page here, if you click on help for men, it won't direct you here. You have to go for help for women. But this list may help you to identify whether you are experiencing domestic violence. Are you afraid of your partner? Well, that's very subjective. Yeah, you may well be afraid of your partner. It doesn't necessarily mean that your fear is grounded in reality. It's also something that men would be less likely to admit to. Men are less fear-prone than women anyway. Whether that's cultural or innate, I can't say. But certainly, being afraid doesn't necessarily mean there's a good reason to be afraid. But anyway, it doesn't matter making a distinction between men and women here, because men aren't going to get to see this usually because it's not on their page. This is specifically for women's questions. Do you feel isolated? Does he cut you off from family and friends? Now, this is where I'm going to start asking the questions. If a woman did this, would we even see it as abuse? Does he cut you off from family and friends? If a man's partner was saying he shouldn't be seeing certain friends because he doesn't approve of them, I think that's almost taken as normal. That's just taken as a thing that women do. Is he jealous and possessive? Again, and it's a funny thing, jealous, because jealous means suspicious. Originally, jealous means suspicious. In fact, even when it meant suspicious, it was a bit of a double bind, because remember, if a man isn't suspicious, that is, he naively assumes that his partner is going to be faithful to him, he was a cuckold. And yet, if he was suspicious, he was then jealous. So it was shameful to be a cuckold, but it was shameful to be jealous too. So that was a sort of double bind that men used to be put in. But over time, jealous has actually sort of changed its meaning, so it actually means expecting fidelity of your partner. It's not that it's a lack of trust in your partner, which is what jealous used to mean. It's now come to mean expecting her to stay faithful. I feel there's been subversion of the meaning of the word jealous over the years. But so I don't know what meaning the word jealous is here. But again, jealous and possessive are things that women are towards their male partners, just as much as men are towards their female partners, and wouldn't even think of it as abuse, ultimately. Does he humiliate or insult you? I don't know where to begin there. Again, something that I think a lot of men experience at the hands of their female partners is insults. And you would not be taken seriously if you said, oh, keep insulting me. Does he verbally abuse you? As you know, we haven't talked about violence at all yet, have we? Does he verbally abuse you? Does he say you are useless and couldn't cope without him? Again, another thing that women frequently say to men is tell them they're useless and they couldn't cope without her. Oh, at last, some actual physical violence mentioned. Does he physically hurt you? Does he shove, slap, punch, or kick you? That's probably the first question there where we would actually consider that to be abuse. Generally, most of us would consider that to be abuse, and we know that was abuse. Has he threatened to hurt you or people close to you? Again, I would probably consider that to be abuse. But this is an interesting double standard as well, because I've known several women that have, rather than threatening to hurt you directly, they have threatened to get their brother onto you, or get their ex-boyfriend onto you. Does he constantly criticize you? Again, yeah, that sounds shit. It sounds shit living with somebody that constantly criticizes you, but it is a thing that men experience at the hands of their female partners frequently. Not only is it something that men frequently experience at the hands of their partners, we have a word for it, don't we? The word is nagging. We say, oh, she's always nagging at me. To talk about women nagging is considered to be sexist. So, to actually even talk about that form of abuse, when the abuser is a woman, is sexist. But now, if you're a woman, and your partner keeps criticizing you, you can actually claim that you are a victim of abuse. I mean, we're just trying to get the fact that men experience physical violence recognized, right? Things like criticism and insults and being told you're useless, even trying to claim those kinds of abuses towards men, that's just taken as read. We just accept that. That's how women are towards men. They constantly criticize you, they insult you, they tell you you're useless. I mean, this is what, basically what we're discovering here is if a man treats his wife the way feminism treats all men, he would be counted as an abuser. So why do we not consider feminism to be abusive to men? Well, we do, obviously, but in society as large, it's not considered to be abusive to all men. Does he have sudden changes of mood which dominate the household? Have you ever been with a partner that has had sudden changes of mood? Women boast about that, don't they? Women have passed around memes saying, if you can't accept me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best. I mean, actually saying, I have constant changes of mood and you have to live with it. Is he charming one minute and abusive the next? Like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? And this is a key one, because this is sort of Sandra Hawley's hobby horse. Because she's written a book about it. She's written a book about danger of charming men. It's the charming men you gotta watch, because the charming men that turn out to be abusive. Now, there's two possible interpretations of this. One is, she's talking about sociopaths, and sociopaths are charming because they are brimming of confidence, because they don't experience punishment in the same way. And by punishment, I don't just mean actual physical punishment meted out by other human beings. I'm talking about negative experiences in life. Doesn't affect them, which makes them have problems with compulsive gambling, for example, because the fact they keep losing money just doesn't affect them. Just water the ducks back. The fact they lose money. All they remember is the winning. So they remember all the times they won, and they forget all the times they've lost. And as a consequence, they are brimming of confidence, and also they don't really learn right from wrong either. Well, I guess that's one of the theories of how sociopathy works. I don't know if that's the current theory. You've got to bear in mind that I did psychology about 20 years ago. So that's one possible reason why somebody who's charming might actually turn out to be abusive. But there's another that occurs to me, and that is if somebody's being too much of a perfectionist about their own behaviour, that is obviously going to cause an awful lot of stress. And when they break down, when despite being perfectly nice, trying really, really hard to be nice, they still fail to be nice, still get it wrong, maybe they flip out. I mean, there might be a link between trying really, really, really hard to be nice and having the sort of levels of stress that are going to make you flip out. But of course, Refuge's view of abusers is they're all in control and there's no mental health issues. Does he control your money? Do you change your behaviour to avoid triggering an attack? Are you unsure of your own judgment? Are you unsure of your own judgment? I'm going to come back to that a little bit later with reference to something else. But right now, what I want to bring attention to is Catherine McKinnon, who went out of her way to make men unsure of their own judgment with such phrases as, men are systematically conditioned not even to notice what women want. They may not have a glimmer of women's indifference or revulsion. And also, men who are in prison for rape think it's the dumbest thing that ever happened. It isn't just a miscarriage of justice. They were put in jail for something very little different from what most men do most of the time and call it sex. The only difference is that they got caught. This is her argument for mens rea not being taken into account in rape cases. But similarly, she wasn't actually keen to reinforce women's sense of their own judgment as well when it came to sex. This is Catherine McKinnon on Rape and Consent. Women have a seemingly endless capacity to lie both to ourselves and others about what gives us pain and what gives us pleasure. This is not all that surprising. If what we need to do to survive materially and psychically is have heterosexual penetration 3 to 5 times a week, then we'll do it. And if the current ethic is that we must not only do it, but enjoy it, well then we'll enjoy it. We report as pleasure what we feel as pain. It is terribly difficult to get to the bottom of these lies, partly because we convey them not just with our words, but with our bodies. It is now a commonplace that women don't feel at home with male language, but this is no wonder, when what we've mainly learned to do with it is lie. She was saying that about women who enjoy sex. She was kind of saying, women who think they enjoy sex, they're just lying to themselves. And men, they don't know that women are lying to them. I remember in the 80s when people like McKinnon and Dworkin were particularly powerful, culturally powerful. It was a thing. It was quite a hip thing to talk about women faking orgasms and how common it was for women to fake orgasms. The Harry Met Sally scene came out of a feminist culture at the time, which was to talk about how prevalent the faking of orgasms was. It's come round again. It's resurfaced in the last couple of years. There was an article, let's fish it out somewhere. There's an article about women faking orgasms that's come back out again. It was a feminist thing to let everyone know that women fake their orgasms, so that men would feel insecure about whether they were doing the job properly. Even if they asked, did you come? And even if she says she does, you go, you're only saying that, you're only saying that to please me. You don't have to say that to please me, you don't have to say that to please me. If you didn't, I'll keep going. If you want me to. Yeah, so talking about undermining judgment, or undermining a sense of one's own judgment, that's something feminists do all the time. particularly with regards to sex. Because sex is the real big threat. Sex is a real threat to feminists. Because if the whole point is to be divisive and divide men against women, and sex is the thing where men and women are at their most liking each other, at their most communing. This is what the point made in 1984. Men and women are at their most communal as a pairing immediately after sex. So the last thing you want to do is make them feel comfortable about it. My experience in the field, quite contrary to what some of the feminists are telling me, my experience in the field was women are very offended by the suggestion that they might be lying about the fact they've had an orgasm. They find it very offensive. Firstly, they say, "Can't you tell?" Yeah, but I thought you weren't just really good as an actress. Anyway, let's look at confession of mangina. Moving on. There we go. As a form of abusing everyone, really, by telling women that they don't know that they enjoy sex, and telling men that they can't possibly know whether or not their partner's enjoying sex. She was undermining our own judgment, wasn't she? Okay, perhaps bringing up Catherine McKinnon's a bit extreme, because she is a bit out there, isn't she, as feminists go. She's like one of the out there feminists that you bring up that you want to make out that feminists are mad. Having said that, she is a legal advisor internationally, so the fact that she's a barking mad outlier does not mean that she is insignificant. And besides which, one of the people that is clearly influenced by her is Alison Saunders, who is the head of the CBS currently. Because some of the things that Alison Saunders said have been directly reiterating things that Catherine McKinnon said. I think there's something rather more pertinent in terms of affecting people's self-judgment, and that's the actual inclusion of emotional abuse. And I just want to play a little bit of Helen Rees, who covers this. So let's listen to Helen Rees.
One of my most guilty secrets is going onto Mumsnet and having a read of the threads now and then when I've had enough of working and so on. And one thing that really strikes me about the Mumsnet threads is a very high number of the really popular threads that everyone keeps coming back to go along the lines of, I don't know if my boyfriend is abusing me. I don't know if I'm in a controlling relationship. And the way these go along is, often it'll be a new relationship, but not always. I got drunk last night, I came back at 2 in the morning, now my boyfriend hasn't talked to me, or my husband hasn't talked to me for 2 days, he's giving me the silent treatment. Is he a control freak? Am I in an abusive relationship? And then you get lots of other people piling in on the thread and saying, yes, you know, here are 10 signs to look for. The silent treatment is one form of abusive behaviour. And then you get other people saying, well, I don't know, how often do you come back late? Did you say you'd be back earlier? And so on. And it just really concerns me. That's obviously only one example, but this is something, a phenomenon I do see around me. It really concerns me that we are being encouraged to look for the dark side of our relationships. We're encouraged to dwell on the idea that, you know, is he maybe an abuser? Is he maybe controlling me? I don't really know. And what's even worse in a way than looking for the dark side of your partner, I think, is looking for the dark side of yourself. And this seems to me something that people also do. And I wouldn't even exclude myself from this. I mean, maybe you'll tell me that I just read way too much of this violence research and I should stop worrying about it. But I find it even starts to get to me, and I think, you know, am I controlling? Am I abusive? I mean, I've left my kids at home for 2 days with my partner, and on my way here, you know, I phoned up to see how they all were, and practically the first thing I was saying was, have they done any of their homework today? Have they done their piano practice? Probably an overbearing mother, but then I sort of checked myself and I thought, well, you know, am I regulating my partner's behaviour there? Am I sort of Am I controlling his activities? And I think when we start to question even ourselves, and look for the dark side of ourselves, this is something that really, really concerns me. And I think ultimately what we're seeing in this widening understanding of domestic violence, this looking for the dark side of our partners and even ourselves, is really a distrust of the very notion of intimacy.
And what I quite liked about Helen Rees there, she put herself in the position. She does actually earlier in that speech. I didn't include it there because I only took a little clip. She does acknowledge that it is most likely to be men that are going to be accused of these things. It's not likely that women are going to be accused. And I think that's almost partly why most women are okay with the goalposts being moved. They're okay. The wider the goalposts, the better, because they only see themselves as being victims. They don't see themselves as ever being on the receiving end of an accusation. But Helen Rees is obviously conscientious enough to go, hold on, do I do that? I think I might do. And I quite liked that. And but she picked up both bits of it there, of course, because it's not only the fact that you might be going, am I an abuser? Which she had the sense of empathy to put herself in that position. As I say, most women, I think, would not be thinking that. But she also said, of course, it leaves everyone thinking, am I being abused? The high levels of subjectivity involved in emotional abuse or controlling behaviour, where you actually have to ask people online, do you think I'm being abused? This happened last night. Am I being abused? I don't know. It's about distrusting your own judgment. Who's making us distrust our own judgment there? It's not our partners making us distrust our own judgment, is it? In one of their poster campaigns about the warning signs of domestic violence, one of the things it's got on the list there is, are you starting to walk on eggshells to avoid making him angry? Talk about, does he make you feel like you're walking on eggshells in the relationship? I think feminism makes us feel like we're walking on eggshells in relationships. Because feminism tells us that almost everything we do can be seen in some way as abusive. Does he damage your possessions? Does he smash up the furniture? Does he threaten to harm or kill the pets? Does he threaten to kidnap or get custody of the children? Does he drive fast because he knows it scares you? Does he lock you out of a house during an argument? And if a woman did that, you would assume that she was doing that in self-defense, wouldn't you? Then that could well be that he was doing that in self-defense as well. Does he tell you what to wear? Or how to do your hair? Yeah, that sounds controlling. Yeah, it sounds quite controlling. It also sounds quite feminine as well. So anyway, domestic violence takes many forms. Physical abuse, it has, which of course is what we consider to be violence. Emotional abuse, which is all those things that we wouldn't consider to be violence. They may be mean, but it's interesting. If we were being gender egalitarian on the point of view of emotional violence or emotional abuse, I think most husbands would be able to claim that their wives were emotionally abusive. Sexual abuse. Partner should not use force or threats to make you have sex. He should not make you perform sexual acts with which you are uncomfortable. He should not criticize your performance. If he does any of the above, he's using sex to assert his authority and control you. I just can't get over He should not criticize your performance. I'm just thinking, if there's a real gendered form of abuse, it would be criticism of performance. Does he damage your possessions? Does he smash up the furniture? Does he threaten to harm or kill the pets? Does he threaten to kidnap or get custody of the children? Does he drive fast because he knows it scares you? Does he lock you out of a house during an argument? And if a woman did that, you would assume that she was doing that in self-defense, wouldn't you? Then that could well be that he was doing that in self-defense as well. Does he tell you what to wear? Or how to do your hair? Yeah, that sounds controlling. Yeah, it sounds quite controlling. It also sounds quite feminine as well. So anyway, domestic violence takes many forms. Physical abuse, it has, which of course is what we consider to be violence. Emotional abuse, which is all those things that we wouldn't consider to be violence. They may be mean, but it's interesting. If we were being gender egalitarian on the point of view of emotional violence or emotional abuse, I think most husbands would be able to claim that their wives were emotionally abusive. Sexual abuse. Partner should not use force or threats to make you have sex. He should not make you perform sexual acts with which you are uncomfortable. He should not criticize your performance. If he does any of the above, he's using sex to assert his authority and control you. I just can't get over He should not criticize your performance. Men are criticized on their performance, and women aren't generally. Women don't traditionally get blamed for sex being poor. It's considered almost sassy to criticize male sexual performance. Have you heard Lily Allen's song, Not Fair? Not Fair is a song about a guy with premature ejaculation. This is a very feminist thing as well. This implication that men with premature ejaculation do it deliberately. They do it deliberately out of pure selfishness. It's not that they have a sexual dysfunction, they're doing it deliberately out of selfishness. Because if you actually have genuine premature ejaculation, premature, that means you don't get an orgasm either. Because you have to build up tension. I don't have to really go into the complexities of it. But a man who has proper premature ejaculations, i.e. he comes very, very, very quickly, as opposed to just coming before she does, which technically isn't premature ejaculation, it's just inconveniently timed ejaculation. If he has genuine premature ejaculation, he doesn't have an orgasm either because the tension isn't building up. The tension that creates the pleasure when it's released doesn't build up enough. And that's something that was really missed. So it was always treated like any guy having a premature ejaculation. Oh, you've had your fun, you don't care about me. Psychological or medical problems that may be causing premature ejaculation vary a great deal. But it can be tied up with things like sexual guilt and sexual anxiety or hormonal problem. But it's a problem. It's a sexual dysfunction. It's not something that somebody chooses to have. Financial abuse. One of the most powerful ways that a man can control his partner is by using financial abuse. There are many different forms of financial abuse, but it might include things like your partner taking your money, stopping you from working. Why would you do that? Why would anyone do that? He's a fucking idiot if he's stopping his wife from working. You want the financial burden of the whole household, do you pillock? Right. Placing all the bills or debts in your name, or monitoring how you spend money and other financial resources, each of to effect. I'm not sure about the last one. I think the last one's probably quite reasonable. Monitoring how you spend money, especially if it's his money. If you feel that your partner is limiting your financial independence, you're experiencing financial abuse, find out more about financial abuse. Now bear in mind, all the times we hear the feminists talk about the gender wage gap, which is actually a gender earnings gap, not a gender wage gap. What it actually means is men earn more money than women do, and they earn more money quite frequently by doing more overtime, going for promotions that women perhaps wouldn't because they're inconvenient, that would involve change in lifestyle, and generally working longer hours when women choose part-time jobs. And some of this revolves around parenthood, of course, and the divvying out of duties of parenthood. And the gender earnings gap that exists only exists for married couples. Single people, particularly under the age of 30, there's no difference in the earnings. In fact, women earn slightly more than men do. It's only among married couples that men earn more than women. So men are earning more than women in order to give some of that money to women. And similarly, just as much as there is a gender earnings gap, there is also a gender spending gap. that the more consumer spending is done by women than it is by men. So in fact, there is a significant number of women that are spending men's money, because the men are earning the money and the women are spending the money. If financial abuse is a gendered thing, you'd think that it was something that women were doing to men more frequently than men were doing to women. Women are taking men's money and spending it to a much greater extent than men are taking money off of women that is rightfully theirs. And then the final thing on that list of what counts as financial abuse is controlling your spending. Well, if he's the one earning the money and she's spending the money on things that seem frivolous to him, you see, the difference is he knows how much money costs because he's the one who has to pay for the money with his labour and with his time and with little bits of his life. Now, she, on the other hand, knows the value of money, i.e. she knows what money can buy, but she doesn't know the cost of money because she didn't have to. I'm assuming, of course, that there is traditional conjugal roles are occurring in the household. I'm not assuming that a household, egalitarian household, I'm assuming a household in which there are conjugal roles set out. Which, post having children, is not an unreasonable assumption, because however egalitarian a couple aspires to be, as soon as children come along, they too tend to fall into traditional conjugal roles. But in a household where traditional conjugal roles exist, he is aware of the cost of money, i.e. what do you have to spend in terms of bits of your life, in terms of threats to your life, in terms of threats to your health, in order to get that money. And she knows the value of money, i.e. what you can get in exchange for that money, which creates a tension between them to begin with, right? Particularly in the economy that we currently live in which there is high inflation on the cost of consumer goods, and there's very flattened wage inflation, i.e. wages aren't going up very quickly at all. Wages are not keeping up with the rate of inflation. So she's aware that the money he's giving her doesn't have as much value as it used to have. He's aware that the money she's expecting from him is costing him a lot more than it used to in terms of the stress he's under and the exhaustion he's facing. So the combination of traditional conjugal roles with an economy that's not supportive of workers' rights is putting relationships under a great deal of pressure, which Refuge are going to interpret as domestic violence in the form of financial abuse. But if she is spending the money on stuff that's frivolous, and it's his money that he's earned for the household, I think he has a right to say, I think you're spending too much. That shouldn't be classed as abuse. Alright, let's go and have a look at the men's now. So, if you finally go to the page of information and support for male victims of domestic abuse, much less in the way of information here. Although you do have the same rights as an abused woman, so presumably you can claim that you've been emotionally abused. I wonder why fewer men do, seeing as so many of the things on that list were things that are almost taken as normal that women can do to men, and that actually doesn't make them abusive, it makes them kind of sassy. Let's go to the men's advice line. Men's advice line is, of course, Respect as well. It's the same company. Always closed. It's always been closed, the live chat bit. Every time I've gone there, I've noticed it's closed. Right, let's go to heterosexual male victims of domestic abuse. Now, none of this list of things that count as abuse. What it does say here, though, is do not retaliate. It's not safe. Always try to avoid retaliating, as it may escalate things and you might get seriously hurt. Well, I think it's kind of true. I do think retaliation probably escalates things. Think about how you can leave the situation when you recognise that the abuser may become violent to you. It's really funny if you look at Joe Todd's training school for men that isn't earlier video I did. I talk about time out and the practice of time out, and which is the same thing. Is basically if you're an abuser and you think you might be abusive, the thing to do is to take a time out. This is what you're trained in the domestic violence perpetrator program. Is you've got to go off until you've calmed down if you think you might be abusive. And in that video, in the paper that I'm reading, it's saying it's a problem in some way if the victim decides to go off instead and have the timeout. The timeout should be had by the perpetrator, not the victim. But here, it's saying the exact opposite. So basically, remembering there is any DVP programs for men at the moment, what it's basically saying is if it's going to happen, it's the man's responsibility to get out of there. Doesn't matter who's the abuser and who's the victim. If you're the man, it's your job to leave the situation. Anyway, chief thing is, if you retaliate and the police are called, it may be that they see you as the abuser, and you could be arrested and charged, particularly if your victim has any injuries caused by your retaliation. The thing I want to note is how extensive that list was for female victims to identify whether or not they are being abused. There isn't the same extensive list for the male victims of abuse. On the contrary, they're warned that they may be seen as the abuser. In fact, I may remind you that what it actually said was, am I being abused? There's a question you could click on if you're a woman, going to the woman's site. There's nothing of that on the men's site. If you don't know you've been abused, you're not been abused. Only those that know they've been abused have been abused. Whereas if you're a woman, you might not know you've been abused. In fact, may I remind you what Vera said.
In they go, the refuge worker has immediate access to the victim and can just talk. And they really have as a motto, whatever it takes.
Is it just me, or is that a really scary motto? Whatever it takes. Sounds a bit like the ends justify the means, isn't it?
So sometimes the person doesn't realise they've been suffering from domestic abuse at all.
Sometimes they don't even realise that they're a victim of domestic assault at all. It's kind of worrying though, isn't it? Whatever it takes, and they may not realise that they're a victim. So whatever it takes includes doing your darndest to convince them that they are a victim, even if they don't think they are. In fact, that made me think of something that we read earlier. Are you unsure of your own judgment? Yeah, that was it. Are you unsure of your own judgment? Is that the form his abuse takes to make you unsure of your own judgment? Sometimes they don't realise they've been abused at all. It seems to me the whole system is geared towards false positives for the question, is the woman a victim of domestic abuse? And towards false negatives if the question is the man a victim of domestic abuse? Finally, as I say, the Male Advice Line is the same organisation as Respect, which has a bit on male victims, which is the toolkit for working out whether somebody claiming to be a victim of domestic violence is actually the perpetrator, and the DPPP program. So what led to Joe Todd, challenging men's violence and abuse of entitlement and privilege, to take it upon Respect to start delivering a helpline to men. Could it be the fact that women's refuges were told to help male domestic violence victims or lose their funding back in 2009? Right, okay, so that's it for this video. If I end it here, then it gets to be a video specifically about domestic violence. It means I didn't get very far into Battle of Ideas, but that's okay. Once Lydia Smith stops talking, we go along at a faster pace because she's the real bigot in the lineup. The other people in the lineup are far more nuanced. So as this has wound up being a video about Refuge, and I've talked about Joe Todd's tweet before about male privilege, and Joe Todd runs Respect, but Refuge is run by Sandra Hawley. So that Sandra Hawley's lovely. Perhaps Joe Todd hates men, but perhaps Sandra loves men. I'm joking, of course. Perhaps. So let's read a quote from her book called Power and Control, Why Charming Men Can Make Dangerous Lovers. I haven't read it. I've only read a review. But the review gives us a quote from it. However bitingly sarcastic, however cruel and venomous a woman may be, I do not believe that a man feels that he is being controlled by such a woman in the way that a woman is controlled by her abuser. So she has a one-sided view that all those things that we talk about as being emotional abuse are only abusive if a man is doing it to a woman. If a woman's doing it to a man, it's not really abuse, because men are thick-skinned and stoical, and we don't really have feelings in the way that women do. This isn't the person you'd want to go to if you were in an abusive relationship and you were a man. I would recommend Mankind Initiative and leave Refuge well alone. The biggest problem with the one-sided attitude that Sandra Hawley has to abuse, particularly when you expand it into emotional abuse, is not that it's going to just create false negatives that abused men won't you recognise as being abused. It's also going to create false positives that women that aren't being abused are going to think they're being abused when it comes to the conclusion they're being abused. In fact, it preys on women's insecurities and feelings of doubt, exploits their feelings of doubt. And the DVPP programs that is provided by Respect are tantamount to abuse. And if you want to see more on that, if you haven't previously seen them, have a look at Joe Todd's Training School for Men. And if you want to know more about sort of a collection of organisations which are sort of clustered together, the CPS is one, and Refuge and Respect. So have a look at what I think is a trilogy on the playlist, Vera and Friends, which is Vera's Fallen Women, Vera's Missionary Work, and Joe Todd's Training School for Men. And for more information about that sort of cluster of establishment feminism in the UK. Fun fact, Sandra Hawley's book, The Charm Syndrome, which is about men that are seen charming one minute and then are being abusive the next, is endorsed by none other than Sherry Booth, QC, or perhaps, as we are more familiar with her in this patriarchal world, Sherry Blair. She is quoted on the back saying that she hopes the book will show thousands of women they are not alone and encourage them to take the first step. I wonder if Sherry Blair knows what it's like to be married to a man who is charming one minute, seems to promise everything, and then the next minute he's bombing some innocent children in a foreign country on a false pretext.